Hi, I'm Greg Wilson, and you're listening to the House Culture Podcast.
House Culture.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the House Culture Podcast. I'm your host and managing editor at House Culture, Matt Rouse. Thanks for joining us, streaming or downloading, but most importantly, listening. Hopefully you're back once again. But if this is your first time tuning in, where have you been? We at House Culture are a collective of house music fans who have come together through their mutual love of the beat to celebrate the spirit of house music. You can get your daily fix of all things house culture on our Instagram feed at houseculture.net. But as you can see with this podcast, we've already built up a hefty back catalogue of iconic characters from the scene who have all been happy to sit down for a candid chat to tell us how this thing called house music has shaped their life. Speaking of icons, in this very special episode, I am so proud to say we chat with legendary DJ Greg Wilson, the first person to mix together two records live on television. Seriously, check that out on YouTube. This is a man who takes his profession very seriously, and rightly so. As you'll hear in this podcast, Greg has been studying the DJ profession from a very young age.
I left school as a professional DJ, that was my job. I never had a normal job at all. And, I remember looking through an old list of dates I did from back then, and I remember seeing a period of about 3 months where I think I only had 1 or 2 nights off. It was every night.
How when Electro first blew up, he was in exactly the right place at the right time.
The whole thing explodes, and I find myself in possession of the 2 biggest club nights in this half of the country.
Just what it was like hosting a regular night at a pre-acid house era Hacienda.
The DJ booth was in a room to the side of the stage that was where you looked out of a slat and saw people's legs.
And describes what his main aim was for his triumphant comeback to the DJ scene.
When I came back into this, I was sure of one thing, and that was that I didn't want to be Mr. Nostalgia playing the golden hits. That was not what I was about. And so the edits allowed me to play older stuff in a contemporary fashion and also plug in other things into that to keep that kind of freshness to it.
So, just like one of Greg's sets, this is an epic one that will take you on a journey, maybe down a few avenues you didn't quite expect, but by the end of it, you'll be in a much more knowledgeable place. Enjoy.
House Culture.
Now, Greg, it's great to chat to you. Thanks for finding the time for us in your very busy schedule. We're sat here in the basement green room of the Old Queen's Head in Islington before you take to the decks tonight in a couple of hours. That is where we are right now, but what we want to do is kind of start at the beginning for you, for your journey in music.
Mm-hmm.
What sticks out for you in your mind about first discovering music and having like emotional reaction to it?
Well, I come from a seaside town called New Brighton, which is across the River Mersey from Liverpool, and it used to be a holiday resort. When I was a kid, it was still like a day trip resort, and people came over on the ferries from Liverpool and came in from different places, and there was fairgrounds, there was a big swimming pool, there was a beach. So there was music always around from the fairgrounds and stuff like that, and people playing transistor radios, they sunbathed, and also I lived in, it was a pub and functions rooms. They did like weddings, 21st, those kind of parties. And so, within the pub there was a jukebox, there were mobile discos coming out in and out every weekend into these functions rooms, and I kind of sit there with my mum and the bottle of Coke and hear all these DJs playing and hear the music. So, and then further to that, perhaps the main influence was that I had an elder brother and sister who were both buying singles, and fortunately for me, they were buying like all the great soul records of the 60s, like on labels like Motown and Stax Atlantic and the reggae label Trojan, and so all these singles were coming into my world as well. I'd eventually inherit them, I'd kind of take them, myself. So all this was happening before, I was 10,
Wow.
I did have an appreciation of music by that point, you know, certainly black music, and had a deep emotional resonance. I mean, a lot of the struggle from the black side I understood through the music, and you know, tracks like A Ball of Confusion by the Temptations, and you know, even like Patches, Clarence Carter. These songs talked about the struggle of black people, and talked about the times in which people live. Change is going to come, of course, Sam Cooke, these types of songs, and they did resonate with me. And one major thing that at a very early age that I remember kind of formulating it within myself was, at the time there was obviously a lot of racism, and black people were seen as lesser in some sort of way, and from my youthful standpoint I couldn't square that, because how could they make this music, how could they be doing this? So it was more than just liking music. There was something else going on within that kind of touched me, and that was the soul music. You know, that was my first great love. Just listen to those records over and over and over, you know, and you know, they're just part of my psyche now, you know, they're in there.
And that was before you were 10 years old, pretty much?
Well, yeah, I mean, I started like actually buying records when I was 11. I mean, I'd acquired records before then. As I said, we had a jukebox in the pub, and the jukebox man used to come round every month or so to change the records, and if I was about and I could see him, I could generally grab a few of the records that he was changing from him. So, you know, I'd do that as well. But eventually, you know, I mean, I kind of started to collect myself, and you know, so by the age of 13, 14, I had a pretty decent 7-inch single collection when I think of it. So at 15, when I started to play in clubs, you know, I was already stocked up musically, and you know, I knew where I was at.
So you were quite ahead of the curve in terms of when you first got those decks, and you had that massive collection that you just wanted to share with people.
Well, I mean, I say massive. It wasn't massive. It was enough to actually go out and play initially. You know, it was massive for somebody of my age. Although I had a friend who was the same age, and he was like really into electronics, and he was also into records, and we met at school and stuff. And he built a mobile disco for himself. He had somebody who lived around the corner who was a mobile DJ, and he saw what he had and how it all fitted together, and he built his own. His first one, he did it within this old drawer, and they were literally two old record players. There was a switch between one deck and the other deck. There was no kind of faders and crossfade or anything like that. It was very rudimentary, but you know, impressive for me at the time. And I eventually, when he upgraded, he then built another console which was really good, and the third console, and when he got his third console, I bought the second with another mate, and we set up as a mobile disco. But I only did that for a few months because I landed a job in a local club. I was actually upstairs in the function room doing the mobile, and the DJ hadn't turned up, and they said, can one of you do downstairs? And a lot of clubs at the time had their own records, so that wasn't an issue, you know, that I could take a few from upstairs, but they had most of, and I did that night, and on the back of that I got offered, it was a Saturday night as well, Saturday night residency, and it was a place called the Chelsea Reach, and further down the road was another club called the Penny Farthing, and no sooner had I started at the Chelsea than the Penny offered me a few nights there. And so
how old were you at that?
15.
Wow.
And
so you weren't even really old enough to be in these places?
No, and they did at one point suss it all out, and there was a moment where I thought that it was all going to fall through, but then they came back and said, you can work here as long as you don't drink. And to be honest, they turned a blind eye to that as well. So it all worked out fine. So at the time when really I should have been studying for O-levels and that kind of thing, I was working 6-7 nights a week in clubs. You know, it really escalated, so that I left school as a professional DJ. You know, that was my job. I never had a normal job at all, and you know, I remember looking through an old list of dates I did from back then, and there was I remember seeing a period of about 3 months where I think I only had 1 or 2 nights off. You know, it was every night. It wasn't like now where you kind of you tour or whatever, or you do the weekends. You know, it was because back then, like, the pubs were closed at 10:30.
Yeah.
So still, there's people wanted to have a drink later, so that's where the clubs came in, and a lot of the more interesting nights happened midweek. The more experimental things.
Yeah.
were going on.
So were you playing the same style of music every night? Was it a different style every night, or how were you kind of approaching those?
Well, back then it was the music that was played in the type of clubs. I'm in a small backwater place, really, in a sense, and so the music, by and large, was what was in the charts. And that's what people played, alongside oldies. I mean, I always had a yen for like bringing in newer records, and so that was my thing. I wanted to be the DJ that you heard the stuff first. And another thing that kind of set me apart was I bought a book, and there used to be a DJ on Radio 1 called Emperor Roscoe, and he did a few albums which were like compilations of Atlantic Soul tracks, and it was great. And he had this book, and I bought this book. I would have been 16, and in the back of it was a list of all the record company addresses, and I realised that record companies had things called promotions departments where they were servicing DJs with stuff before it was released. And so I really embraced that. I contacted everyone, and within probably 12 months I was on every mailing list that there was, all the big labels. I was receiving all this, all the new UK releases 6 weeks in advance, often, of the release in this country. And I was then going to London and meeting all the people who worked in the club departments and getting stuff even quicker, because I get it direct from source before they'd done the mail out sometimes. And so that's the approach that I took that was different, I suppose, to my contemporaries, whereas they'd gone buy their records at the shops as normal. But I'd already kind of stepped ahead of that. So if I was buying records, it was moving more into imports. I didn't need the British records. So it was looking to what was coming in from the States. And quite early on, I was, even, as I say, when I was 16, I remember buying imports of Parliament's album Mothership Connection, which was a revelation to me. Brass Construction's first album, which was a huge and very influential record. It's kind of been lost through time, but as a funk, a lot of British bands like High Tension and Light of the World took their cues off that album. And so, I was supplementing the music that I was playing with newer and newer music till eventually, well, you mentioned with the nights always the same. The first kind of specialist night I did was in a club called the Penny Farthing, which on the Monday night, it was a funk night, so it was specifically geared towards more kind of newer music and taking away that kind of pop element that you might have to inject, into the weekend. But it wasn't until I got to the next club that I worked at, and I started there when I was 17. It was actually next door to this place, the Penny Farthing, a club called the Golden Guinea, but it was the better club. The people who went to the Guinea weren't in the Penny, and the ones that got knocked back from the Guinea were the ones that went to the Penny. It was that kind of thing. So I'd kind of moved up to supposedly better crowd. Certainly, within it enabled me to really set my scene, and that's what I managed to do there. That I then built my reputation. You would hear the music first here, and eventually Blues and Soul magazine, which was a big concern back then, on a national level, and had DJ charts in which I contributed to myself, and they sent the kind of club correspondents, and they did a glowing piece about my little club, and amazing. The Golden Guinea was the club where I was able to bring that to fruition and have my own little local scene. And I loved it there, I had a great time and I knew lots of people. But I also was aware that I needed to move on in terms of developing a real career within this, to step to a next level. And back then the next level was radio. That's what everyone was aiming at, to get on the radio. You didn't have a situation where DJs toured or anything like now. Although what there was a specialist, what was then called jazz funk scene, where the music that was played was the black music strands of soul, funk, disco, but also the jazzier element, Roy Ayers type stuff, Lonnie Liston Smith, these kind of Ronnie Laws, these kind of artists, Herbie Hancock, and then even more kind of out and out jazz tracks, and this was a very specialist scene that existed throughout the country, but was really kind of, there's north and there was south. So in the north there were all-dayers where the top DJs from different areas came together on a Sunday or a bank holiday Monday, and it was an all-day event, and they all played their own spots. And the same thing happened in London. The two didn't generally, although there was some kind of crossover, and that was the specialist scene, and that's what I aspired to. I wasn't at that point yet, and it wasn't something you could just walk into. You didn't just announce yourself. You had to earn your spurs in one way or the other.
So was there a kind of roster of big name DJs within that scene that you were looking at and thinking, I aspire to be like those guys, or did you think I can carve my own path into this?
Well, there were two aspects to this. Initially in Liverpool, I went to a club called the Timepiece in 1976. Again, I was 16, and it was a predominantly black club. And the DJ there was a guy called Les Spain, and he had massive respect within the Liverpool DJ community. The DJ stood around his booth with pads taking down tracks, and he was so gracious with it. He'd tell them what the tracks were. He was so confident that next week he'd have more. Brilliant. And I walked into this environment, and I'd never been in an environment where I was, in the minority as a white person, and it was kind of electric from that aspect. I wasn't sure if I was safe, but the dancing and the music, everything felt right. And I met Les, and Les was wonderful with me, and kind of made me feel at home. And I saw in that very much, this is what I'd like to be doing. I'm not saying in this club or whatever, but this is it. That is where I aspire to be, playing to an audience that are really knowledgeable dancers, this great music. And that would transpire later down the line, 5 years later, when I started working at Legend in Manchester. That would be my timepiece. Similar kind of crowd, predominantly black crowd, playing the latest black music. But Liverpool was a bit separate from things in lots of ways, and sadly, after Les, he went to work for Motown in London, and he went on to a really successful career in the music business, and his loss was never compensated fully. I mean, he was, for me, in many ways, the timepiece. Liverpool then, started to experience racial problems around the time of the riots, and lost its way completely. So as far as dance culture goes, there was a divide that came from around about late 70s until the late 80s, really, when Liverpool finally started to embrace dance culture in a similar way to what Manchester had. And so the other thing was, and I was aware of this through reading blues and soul and stuff, where there were DJs like Colin Curtis. He'd come from the Northern Soul scene, and he was at a club called Blackpool Mecca, which was hugely influential. And there was a schism within the Northern Soul scene where Curtis and the other DJ there, Ian Levine, started playing contemporary records alongside the retrospective 60s Northern Soul that Wigan Casino was playing. And the schism was between the Mecca and the Casino. The Casino was keeping with, keep the faith, let's, stick with what we know. The Mecca was pushing ahead, and this New York disco style was coming into play. And Colin Curtis made the transition to the jazz funk scene and took that kind of train spotter sensibility from Northern Soul to jazz, and became one of the, along with Paul Murphy from London, Colin Curtis must be deemed, greatest jazz DJ, from Britain, they were the guys that influenced people like Giles Peterson and things that go on from there. So Colin Curtis and a guy called John Grant, and they worked together a lot around that time at a club in Manchester called Rafters, and you'd see that advertised in Blues and Soul, and they played all dayers throughout the North and the Midlands, and so that was where I wanted to be. I wanted to be on those bills and playing those events and stuff, but there was I couldn't make that way in from the Golden Guinea in New Brighton. So at that moment in time, the possibility wasn't there. And knowing that I wanted to make a proper career out of this, I was open to new ideas. And one of those was when I was 18, I learned that there were a lot of English DJs working abroad, particularly Scandinavia, Germany, some in France, Austria, Switzerland, these kind of places. And there were agencies out there. And so I ended up going over initially I went to Denmark and Norway when I was 18. But I found it hard. I got very homesick. It wasn't the lifestyle now where you get a decent hotel and everything and looked after. And it was stuck in a back room and you were working 6 nights a week or whatever and praying for your night off almost. I mean, there was an enjoyable aspect, but I was down the ladder at the point. I was like on the bottom rung and, not playing the best clubs and stuff. And so I came back after a couple of months and went straight back to the Golden Guinea and carried on there. And when I got to 20, I thought I'll give it another go. And I went out this time to Denmark and then Germany. And much more now, I was on a different level with it. I was a lot more kind of worldly wise to what I was doing. When I went to Germany, it was the first club that had SL1200 turntables.
No way.
The equipment in Germany was way ahead of what we had in the UK at the time. The systems were generally like, nasty tinny kind of. They were an afterthought, like in clubs. We hadn't got to that era where sound had become deemed important. But going somewhere like Germany, which was much more technologically advanced, it seemed, like there were things like hi-fi stack systems and stuff that I hadn't seen. Rich people had them, but general people had them, So, that enabled me to also, I went to another club in Essen, which was a nearby city. I was in a place called Mulheim, and Essen was nearby. And on my night off, I went to a club called Librium, and it was an incredible club again. They had all these hydraulic lighting, and the light controller played off a keyboard, like a musical keyboard type thing, and the DJ was mixing, and he was mixing between kind of dance stuff and alternative stuff. And although I'd come across mixing in 78, I'd gone through my contacts in London, I'd gone to a club called the Embassy, which was like London's attempt at Studio 54. It was a lot of kind of celebrities, and there was a big gay influence there, but it wasn't seen as a gay club. And there was a DJ called Greg James, and he'd come over from America, and he was a friend of Richie Caxor, who was one of the DJs at Studio 54, and he was the first mixing DJ in the UK. And so I'd been there in 78 when he'd worked and heard him play. But like I just said, to do this mixing, although we understood now what it was running these two records together, we just didn't have the equipment. We had these belt-driven turntables. They weren't very speed. If you touched them, the needle jumped. So we weren't set up and prepared for it. So that moment kind of passed. There was talk about it Record Mirror was another major. James Hamilton, who wrote for Record Mirror, and he became the champion of mixing. He was writing about it back then. And so some DJs tried it out, but most DJs thought, stick to the microphone, because it was a microphone-based format then. We announced and back-announced records and all that. But being in Germany and seeing what was happening in this club, and I think the DJ was a guy called Peter Romer, now, with hindsight, and he's one of the, I think he's seen as Germany's first mixing DJ, and I'm pretty sure it was him because I know he worked in that club at certain points in time. And I just thought, in the right environment, so I'd spotted that then. And before I'd gone to Germany, I'd been in Denmark, and I took my car out there, drove out to these places, and I had a bump in the car. I had a couple of weeks before my next contract started, so I decided to go back to the UK, change car, and come back out. But while I was home, I wanted to suss out some of the other agencies in Europe, and a guy I'd met in Norway in 78, I met a couple of great guys in Norway, Nicky Favell and Paul Ray. They were DJs in the same town, and they were really sus. They'd been on the road for a good while, and they knew the lay of the land. I was this wet behind the ears kid, 18-year-old. And I rung Nicky's his dad's house to find out where he was, where in Europe he was. And he said, he's actually in Wigan. He's at this new place, Wigan Pier. And I thought, well, that's only half an hour from where I am. I'll go and see him. So I contacted him. He said, come down on there was a Tuesday night jazz funk night. I think I went there. I went on the Tuesday, and this club just blew my mind. It was a whole different level from anything that I'd seen in the UK. Well, it's seen anywhere really. It was the first club in the country to have a laser system. It had incredible lights. They had a balcony round. People used to just stand and watch the lights. I remember. And the DJ was in this 15-foot high fiberglass frog. They had a light controller with them, so the DJ actually worked to the side with monitors, and the light controller looked out over the dance floor. and everything. This was amazing. And Nicky said to me, he was moving on to a new club that the same company were opening in Manchester, and this was Legend, and there was going to be a vacancy for the DJ here, and they were running auditions for it. And he said, you should, and so I spoke to the owner there, and they were running the auditions the next week, and I was going to Germany. And it was so amazing that part of me almost felt like not going to audition, just for the chance to get this place. But that was crazy, couldn't happen. So I in the end kind of said to the guy who run the club, if I can make a tape, could I send you a tape to show what I do, which was kind of unusual, they like to see. And he said, yeah, okay. I didn't think much of it, but I got to Germany, and I was in, as I say, this first club that had 1200s and everything, and I made my tape and I sent it over to them, and I didn't hear anything. And I think Nicky in the background pushed away, and all of a sudden I got a phone call, and they offered me the job. I was just like so emotional about that, because I didn't really want to be away. I wanted to be back in the UK, but I didn't want to be treading water. This club I worked in, the Golden Guinea, which I loved, as I say, in the late 70s. It had like 2 main floors where music was played, and on the middle floor, or the one when you walked in, the DJ there played all the chart hits, and he also DJ'd between bands that played, they generally played, so it was for an older crowd. Downstairs where I was in the disco, that was for the younger crowd, and I was able to play my thing. And I remember once walking up, and I was stood looking into the other room at the DJ there, a guy called Rob Smedley, who to me at the time seemed really old. He must have been in his mid-30s, and I knew that he'd been in that club. It used to be called the Kraal before that, the early 60s. Jackie Wilson had played there apparently, and he'd been there since then. And I remember it occurring to me, this kind of shudder went through me, and I thought, that could be me, because I enjoy it, this, and my friends, and you can be sucked in. He's here now, he's been here all this time, and it felt like I've got to come away, I've got to pull myself away from it, even though I love it. It's
the comfort zone, isn't it?
It's the comfort zone, it's I had to push myself again, and so that's where it was. And I got this job at Wigan Pier and came to work there, and they had a Tuesday night jazz funk night, which had been really well cultivated by Nicky and a guy called Kelly beforehand. And the club held about 850 to 1,000 people. I think the official capacity was 850, but they went over that, and we put in about 400 or 350 on a Tuesday, which was mad. And these people at the time, that crowd was predominantly white, and it was made up of the regions around, with like Preston they'd come in from, and Warrington, and some from Liverpool, but not so much Manchester. Manchester was covered. That was the kind of holy grail there, really. So it had a really good night going, but Nicky never did the all-dayers, or Kelly before, I don't think ever did any of those. So they were still a little bit separated at the time. And so I went into Wigan, and that's where I picked up my first all-day. I was like kind of small name on there. In fact, they even advertised me as Roadshow and Sound System, which I had no Roadshow, and I think just to kind of give me a bit more billing or whatever. But that was my first step, and I was on the bill with Colin Curtis and John Grant at that point. That's like you've arrived then. It's like you've kind of, you're not in the Premier League, but you're certainly in the Division 2 or whatever it is, or the 4th division. You're in there, and you're building up, and you're going up the rankings.
I mean, certainly, like everything you read about that kind of history, Wigan Pier especially is arguably seen as one of the first kind of super clubs in the UK, from like playing dance music, people travelling from outside of the area to go to. It had an amazing system and a place to play, to see the DJs and hear the music, and it kind of had that that flame that all these people would come towards.
I mean, there was a couple of places just prior to it, like Angels in Burnley, where Ian Levine would work, and a lot of disco was played there. And the Warehouse in Leeds, which was owned by an American, and Greg James, the guy from the Embassy, when he'd done 6 months in the Embassy, he went to Leeds then, and made an impression there too. So the pier went another level, just in terms of the sound and light and everything, and the way they presented it. So it was a different environment. As I said, the clubs when I started off, the sound system was, it wasn't the main thing on the management's mind. Whereas the Pier, everything was around the sound system and the lighting. It was fundamental.
Yeah.
I mean, they advertised as Top American Discotheque, you know. It was very much geared towards what had been happening in New York. It was taking a cue from that. The people who fitted it, you know, there was a company called Bacchus Juliana's, and and Legend, they did as well. I think they were separate and then together at one point, but they did all the Hilton hotels worldwide and stuff, so I think that's how they got persuaded into spending so much. Most clubs would go to a local supplier and get a few bits. They went all the way, you know, with this. And then Legend like took it another stage because it was a more compact club with like a official capacity I think 450, you know, and best sound system I'd ever heard. First club with sub bass I'd heard. Lighting, you don't see it now. I mean, I couldn't even explain. I couldn't tell you. People might say, "Oh, Fabric," and you know what Legend had, what it was able to do on that dance floor. You know, you had things like a laser that was hitting prisms that were built into a ceiling, which also housed the tweeters of the sound system, with the mid-range coming round you, circling, and the sub bass coming underneath. You could like also white out this space completely with smoke and just white light. They had half a mile of neon in shapes, and it was crazy. It was like, it was this really kind of futuristic environment. And what happened there was Nicky started at Legend, and it all was hunky-dory at first, but they had issues there with the music policy. What was happening was that the Wednesday night was the kind of jazz funk night which attracted the black crowd. But when they opened it, they wanted to gear the weekend at a more affluent crowd who might buy drinks and stuff. And you know, truth be told, the black crowd didn't buy drink. They didn't have the money. A lot of people just drunk water. They had enough money to get into a club. You know, I always tell this story about Wigan Pier to give an idea of the dedication of this crowd who had nothing, but they had to be at these nights. I remember speaking to some guys from Birmingham who used to come to Wigan Pier, and they were saying to me that the first thing that they did when they got to Wigan, to the car park, was they siphoned petrol off another car because they only had enough money to get one way down and they needed the petrol to get back. And that was it. That was the level of it, by hook or by crook. Once, you know, these clubs had once these nights became the key nights, I mean. So Nicky had gone into Legend. He'd had an issue with music policy with the management to do with the weekends that forced him to resign. They then brought in on the Wednesday John Grant, who was one of these big name DJs, and you know, it was successful on the Wednesday night with John Grant there. But he got poached by a night in Manchester called The Main Event, which was co-promoted by Blues and Soul and Piccadilly Radio, so it had like tremendous power behind it. You know, full page adverts in Blues and Soul and jingles on Piccadilly and all sorts of stuff going on. And that opened up, and it basically started to wipe out the Wednesday at Legend. They'd lost, you know, a couple of hundred of the crowd, and they were like really struggling to keep it afloat. In the meantime, my Tuesday at the Pier had really done well. You know, I secured it and everything, and now it was building, and so they said to me, do you want to see if you can do anything on, you know, give me a chance to try and save it. And it was a little bit of an outside shot in one way, but the club was so great, and I just, you know, it's a dream to work there. And it took about 9 months, but we turned it right round, and we did it bit by bit. You know, I mean, those first few months, I'd be at the end of the night, I'd say to, you know, the manager, how many were in? You know, 97. Oh God, that's great. We only had 93 last week, and it was a really weird thing because as it developed on, you know, 150 this week. Wow, you know, it's top now. You know, when it got to about 250, 300 people, it closed the other club within weeks. It was gone. The crowd completely switched, and then you have the start of that classic era at Legend where it was just every week there were queues outside. It was full. People were now coming in from, it wasn't just a Manchester crowd, it was Sheffield, Leeds, Bradford, Birmingham, Nottingham, Huddersfield, you know, Liverpool, people coming in. And same with Wigan Pier. Wigan Pier's audience shifted, so whereas it was predominantly white, that shifted again to becoming predominantly black, and a lot of that had to do with the musical shift at the time. And this is...
Yeah, what was the music that you were playing at these
Well, when I
gigs?
went in there, initially, as I say, it was still jazz funk. It was the back end of the jazz funk era. I was playing, you know, out and out, I would even buy like Japanese digital kind of jazz, which wasn't just Japanese artists, there was American artists, but it's the first digital music I ever come across. And they're really expensive, but certain tracks you just had to have. So yeah, you know, at that point, a jazz funk night consisted of jazz funk, i.e., like I say, you know, your Roy Ayers type, Lonnie Liston Swift type thing, straight out jazz or fusion jazz, which was like the faster kind of like sambas and Latin American stuff coming into play, which was really for the kind of specialist dancers, of which there were many. And, you know, the big soul, the big funk, the big disco tracks. And when I say disco, the black side of disco, what would later be called boogie.
Yeah.
That term didn't exist then.
Yeah.
But it was disco funk, you know. It was, and so that was the smorgasbord of different styles that you had. Where it really changed with me was that in '82, as '82 started to unfold, certain records started to appear. Initially, tracks like, I mean, I'd even put D-Train, You're the One for Me into that, even though now, because there were so many derivative records, it doesn't sound that original. When it came out, believe me, it was that kind of choppy synth and everything.
Yeah.
Time by Stone, getting more electronic, things like Electric Funk on a Journey, which was on Prelude, as like D-Train was. And this sound was Peach Boys, Don't Make Me Wait, big one, major moment. And then it really tipped fully into Planet Rock.
Yeah.
And you're into this electro era. And I'd embraced that and gone with that. And the crowd that I was playing to, which was a younger black crowd, were really into that. But the older DJs, they turned their back on it. They felt that this was this machine music that was going to ruin the scene, and it had nothing to do with soul, or all these arguments were put forward. So I had the perfect environment for this music, with this amazing sound system. This was kind of state-of-the-art electronic. It's the last music that sounded like the future, really did sound like the future. And also mixing, now I could bring this into play. So this idea of not talking between, you know, that you start to kind of string the records together, and so that became original. There was very few DJs in the country at that point that were seen as mixing I mean, I think Black Echoes listed, you know, about 8 or 9 of us, you know, at that point in time that were taking this seriously. And so, you know, everything was set for me. I had the right environment. The crowd were incredible, you know, the level of it, the knowledge of, you know, the dance. You had, like, from the jazz funk days, you had crews who would challenge each other. So Birmingham would challenge, Manchester would challenge, Huddersfield would, and there was always these, like, to jazz going on, jazz fusion styles, and a whole jazz dance scene emerged, you know, from those things within this wider scene. And a lot of those jazz dancers were the early break dancers, because they had the athleticism to be able to take on those moves. So when that started in '83, you know, we were primed for that too, you know. And so this electro funk direction, as we called it, all of a sudden, you know, like after 9 months of me being there, bit by bit building it, the whole thing explodes, and I find myself in possession of the 2 biggest club nights in this half of the country.
Yeah.
And nowhere more up front anywhere than what was going off at Legend and the Pier, you know. But Legend was, I think, for me, that was the one. People ask me now, you know, what's the greatest club gig you've got? You know, they maybe expect me to say, oh, the Hacienda, or Space in Ibiza, or, and it's not. It's just every Wednesday at Legend. It was, I couldn't wait to get there. It was what it was all about to me. It was the pinnacle. I'd achieve, you know, there was nowhere else to look. The radio thing with me, I tried to get on radio, and I'd nearly got on radio when I was 18. Well, before I was 18, that was my ambition, to get on radio before I was 18. I nearly got on Radio Merseyside doing the Soul Show. Terry Linnane, who was the DJ, was supposed to leave and take over a Radio 1 slot. And as it worked out, it didn't work out, and I didn't get that. And I was that's when I decided to go to Europe, after the radio thing hadn't come off. But when I was at Legend, Mike Shaft, who did Piccadilly Radio, and it was a massive show. I mean, the biggest, certainly outside London. You had Greg Edwards and Robbie Vincent doing shows in London. Mike Shaft, these 3 were the main ones in the country. And he, when he heard me mixing, said, would you like to come on the radio and do mixes every few weeks? They became a huge thing as well. And that again brought me out to a wider audience, people that weren't venturing into Legend. I mean, a lot of people wouldn't even know about Legend, because unless you read Blues and Soul, or you listened to Mike Shaft's show, or you hung around with black kids, you wouldn't have known it, you know.
It's a real word of mouth.
It was an underground scene, but a sizable underground scene, and it was interlinked with many other examples, you know, through the all-dayer circuit and everything. So Legend became the predominant club on the scene, even though Wigan Pier actually won the awards. And I think that Wigan won the awards because it was a readers' poll in Blues and Soul, and Legend was still Manchester, whereas Wigan, which didn't have any black kind of population as such, I mean, a few people, that was more neutral ground. So I think people like, you know, voted for that as opposed to a Manchester club, politically almost. But for me, Legend, I mean, we won in Blues and Soul top club, second best club, and I got top DJ, you know, for the North. And, you know, we got a clean sweep of that. And so what had happened, in effect, looking at the scene objectively, was that John Grant, who'd gone to this main event, a few months later I'd quit DJing altogether and gone to work as a harbour master. I think, well, that's what he said, a harbour master in I think he worked with hovercrafts and stuff on the south coast, and he'd gone. And that was like, wow. And there was like this vacuum left within the scene, and a lot of the kind of second tier DJs were positioning to stand, you know, into that. And what in effect happened was I came in right through the back door, and I was this young upstart. I mean, I was only 22 when all this was going on, and all of a sudden I had this power. And then the criticism started and the backlash because of the music I was playing, and that I was polluting the scene, and you know, people were writing this in Blues and Soul, and you know, and it was a lot of pressure on this, and at first I really, you know, it felt bad because these were people I looked up to, and you know, and my youthful ego wanted a pat on the back and look how well you're doing, and instead I'm being told that I'm ruining it for people. And so at first there was that, but then I kind of went on the offensive, because I looked at my audience and I thought, who are these, what I thought were middle-aged white people who were like, to tell, you know, this crowd what black music is. And that's how I took that stance, and you know, kind of toughed it out a bit, although it was really uncomfortable. But eventually, after a few big political actions with all-dayers and things like that, where they, you know, one where they said it was a non-electro all-day and I wasn't booked for it, along with another DJ who dared play this dirty music. But it didn't work because all the other DJs caved in and played electro tracks because the crowd demanded it. And so the battle was over then. Legend, Wigan Pier were top of the tree, and everything was hunky-dory, you know, on that level. I worked in other clubs as well around. I mean, I came away from full-time residence at the Pier in '82 to concentrate on just being a specialist. So I had a night in Huddersfield, night in Liverpool, another night in Manchester that I did, you know, alongside the Tuesday and the Wednesday, which was the mainstay. You know, that's where I was at. And then in kind of summer of '83, I knew that Tony Wilson and Mike Pickering and Rob Gretton, who was the manager of New Order, had been in regularly, because Tony Wilson was a local kind of celebrity, he was on the TV. So they'd obviously checked it all out there and everything, and I was asked to like do a dance night, especially dance night on a Friday there.
The Hacienda.
And this is in '83. It opened in May of '82. But it was really struggling. They were finding it very difficult to get enough people through the doors. Obviously wouldn't have survived apart from New Order's success. That's what bankrolled the whole thing. And so I was there on a Friday night for a period of, I think, about 3 months, and it was really difficult because it wasn't set up at all. The DJ booth was in a room to the side of the stage that was where you looked out of a slat and saw people's legs, and the mixer was above your head, so you had to hold your, and it didn't have a crossfade. There was also, I mean, I wrote about all this online, you know, and I also, it came out later that the reason the mixer was so wrong was that there was a second part of the mixer that they hadn't bought, because I'd always say, can you, this mixer's awful, this is, I can't, and they're like saying, there's only 2 in the world, we got it from France and it's supposed to be, I'm like, because I'm this mixing DJ now, but I'm working with my hands tied behind my back. And so my time at the Hacienda we had a few really good nights. We had like the first big breakdancing and body popping championship there, and we had Houdini on, who were like had a big kind of track with Magic's Wand, and Nutriment, a British act that we'd be playing big in the clubs. So we had a few one-off, but generally I remember the Hacienda as being cold and dark, because I did it through the autumn, empty, and just so unlike Legend, which was so right. It was so, I mean, the following year they moved the DJ booth to the balcony, and they never got this. The sound was poor in the Hacienda, always was. They never got it right. It was this cavernous space, it was big, and
so even when you were playing there, you couldn't necessarily see this kind of explosion coming over the horizon in terms of kind of house music.
Oh no, well, certainly not with the Hacienda. Their crowd was like a bit kind of gothy or studenty, and they, into Susie and the Banshees or Bauhaus, or people sometimes would manage to find me in that room. I don't know how they managed to find, someone come and berate me. You're playing this dance shit for, they'd ask me for, something that they like, Sisters of Mercy or whatever, I don't know, but it wasn't. What they were trying to do there, they'd been out to New York, because New Order had played there, and a certain ratio played over in New York. They'd been to clubs like, obviously, Paradise Garage, Loft. But the one that they always talked about was Danceteria. I can see why now, knowing about it, because it was more of an art space as well, and it was a mixture of kind of alternative and dance, and that's what the Hacienda they were trying to get that New York thing going there and mix the crowds up. So they wanted the black crowd in there, but they wanted the alternative. They wanted all these different factions to come together. But at the time, never the twain shall meet. It was so separated. It wasn't doing that, and so it was very difficult for them to get anything to stick, on a week by week basis. And they just like put bands on, or like Smiths and all these kind of people that were playing at the time, and made them, what little money they made that way, but most of it was just like holes in the pockets. It was just leaking out, they were losing money hand over fist. But over the following years, they managed to steady the ship. Mike Pickering on the Friday night with Martin Pendergrass first, and then on his own, and then with Graham Park, developed something, and it was doing really well before the house explosion, so to speak. But come 88, and when Ecstasy arrived there, everything was right. All of a sudden, this place that was so wrong became so right, because it was huge, and it just had the right vibe about it. Found its moment, and there it goes. We have like a world famous club, and people all over the world know about it, but as I say, my time was a little bit different. It wasn't
So this was kind of 1983. You decided to kind of hang up your headphones as a DJ.
Well, that was it. It was at the time I was at the Hacienda. I was here in Legend. I'd kind of got to, there was a few factors to this, and it's very difficult to do in a succinct way. A big thing was breakdancing, which had happened with a vengeance in the summer of 83. It had first come to light with Buffalo Gal's video, Malcolm McLaren, end of 82, which I had a promo of. I was able to show that before anyone had ever seen it, and it was culture shock to the people that were there that night. That they, I worked at a club called the Stars Bar in Huddersfield, and it was a Thursday night, and it was kind of rough, raw crowd, but great crowd, but it was in one of the places where one of the Yorkshire Ripper murders was off the, they wouldn't allow a black night in the city centre of Huddersfield, so it was off the beaten track. But I did this place for a while, and they had a video screen in this place, and I got this Buffalo Gals video from one of the record guys in London. I've been up to London, and I was like, oh my god, because there was a man and he was on his head spinning round, and we'd never seen this before. This was new, and there was, it's the first video with the 4 elements of hip-hop, all 4 in there, and I played it. I decided at 1 o'clock I was going to play it. The club was open till 2, and I played it to the people in there, and it was shock, and it was like this crowd quietened down. And even we still had the microphones, so I grabbed microphone and said, you know, like, so the people at the back can see, you mind sitting down on the dance floor like your school teacher? And they all sat down quietly, because everything changed with that. Them viewing that, nothing was ever the same, you know. As I've said before, it was like, they wouldn't have been more shocked if, you know, the aliens would have landed and walked in the door. That, you know, it was... And so by that summer, a lot of people had practiced and got these worked in these moves. And, you know, one person had a video recorder and they'd sat round and gone over, you know, and there was any video that had a bit of breakdancing in, they were just absorbing it. And then it came out on the streets in 83 summer, and in Manchester a crew called Broken Glass were the first out and took it to Piccadilly Gardens, and some of these lads came to Legend and made me aware of what was going on, and I ended up in this kind of quasi-managerial role, getting them to do a street tour of the Northwest and going to shopping centres, which was incredible, especially in areas where they had no black population, and the white kids looked at them with, like, you know, concern, you know, what's this, they're encroaching on, is this a gang, is this, you know. And then from a distance, like, watch them wind out this lino and put a ghetto black and start dancing, and then come over to them and conversation and what is this and what's this music, and this was wonderful, you know. And it was like, when you look at like the world now and the way that things have been going with race relations and everything, this was another side of that coin where people were coming together and realizing the commonality, and within, you know, the following year, like every like kind of shopping mall in the country, not just in the black areas, was full of breakdancers. And the Street Sounds album, the Street Sounds Electro albums Morgan Khan was putting out, just became the soundtrack of the ghetto blaster for these kids that were. So this was a huge change, and what it did on a club level was that in Legend now, whenever I played Electro, it was challenges.
Yeah. There
were groups of lads challenging each other, taking up the dance floor. It could get rowdy, you know. The girls were getting a little bit fed up because the dancing space was being... So I could feel a schism occurring here, which would kind of happen, that the hip-hop scene would come out of this, and then the house scene wouldn't immediately emerge. Before that, from a black side, there was more of a kind of street soul direction that was for a little while, and then these house tracks started to come into that. I mean, house was just electro, but from a different place initially. Same with techno, it was just electro from Detroit. We didn't even know it was from Detroit. When I played Clear by Cybertron in '83, I didn't know that it was a different city. It was just another electro track, and then you learn, you know, what's going on with things, and that's the start of these other strands. So out of this electro era comes hip-hop, house and techno. You know, it opens the doors for all three of these directions, but there's a process in between, you know, like before it arrives at that. So like, and it was the black kids in Manchester that brought house to the fore. I mean, for years I was kind of saying, I remember the Guardian, or I think it was either the Guardian or Observer, they were going to do a piece on I was been talking to a reporter about the influence of the black community on what happened at the Hacienda. Well, they wanted photographs to back this up, and people weren't taking photographs then, and we couldn't find photographs apart from a professional crew called Foot Patrol dancing in there, and the piece was never written, and it was really frustrating at the time to know what had happened, yet you can't offer evidence. And then wonderfully this video emerged from Moss Side Community Centre in '86, and I think Mike Shaft's playing there, and it's just house. You're listening to kids and you're seeing kids dancing to house, and so this is way before Ibiza. You know, and so it was the black crowd that brought the house through, and it was the fusion dancers like Foot Patrol that applied that style of dancing initially to dancing to house tracks. It wasn't all this kind of hands in the air thing then. It was very much still using foot moves and stuff. And but I'd gone by then. I'd finished, as I say, at the end of '83. I decided, you know, also I wanted to get into record production. I wanted to get into remixing, because I'd now discovered, you know, obviously all these people who were remixing these tracks were DJs like T. Scott and Larry Levan, Francois Kevorkian, Shep Pettibone, Jelly Bean Benitez, Tony Humphries, DJs. And I thought, maybe I can remix. So I was going to London saying, can I remix a track? And they were like saying, yeah, but, you know, it's Americans who remix, you know. It's like, and I was not getting what I wanted. So in the end, I took a kind of lateral step and hooked up with a couple of musicians. One of the guys from A Certain Ratio, another guy was in the like post-punk band magazine, and we did this experimental electro album, which came out as UK Electro for Street Sounds, and so that was '84. That was the first year that I stopped DJing, and for a moment everything was great and looked like it was going well, and then it just imploded and all went pear-shaped, and I found myself kind of stuck in Liverpool at the time, which was really failing badly. It was a depopulating city. There was no prospects. It was like Dick Whittington style down to London, and I was there for a few years and eventually got a deal for the Ruthless Rap Assassins. Kermit had come out of Broken Glass, the Breakdance crew, and with Anderson and Carson and the three of them, we did 2 albums for EMI, and that kind of was a bit of an in-between period, but then it, later on it went into another period of obscurity. So the 90s for me was a real struggle of trying to get projects going but not having the means to do so, and so detaching very much from that world, not going to clubs even, not really being
that
aware.
Whole kind of house music, super clubs, superstar DJ explosion during that 90s era, was that something that you saw and thought, I don't want any part of that at all? Were you not interested in any of the music?
Well, I wasn't even thinking of being a DJ.
Yeah.
At that moment in my life, I wouldn't have, maybe, I did a few one-offs, people asked me to do things, but that was all. I didn't see myself coming back into it at all at the time. My thoughts on that were, initially, musically, and this comes out of the black scene I was a part of, it wasn't just one way. It wasn't just that everything was one BPM and in a similar style. It was a whole, spectrum of different things, and that's the way I always liked it. That changed with the house scene, that all of a sudden people started to narrow into different areas, and I used to hear this term starting. The DJs talked about a set, and I was like, that's what a band does, a set. But now DJs are talking about sets, and I kind of realised that often what and this is like after the rave thing, this is the new kind of era of DJing, I suppose, that by this they kind of meant that they practice all week to play a certain amount of records in a certain order, do it very expertly, it's all fluid and they mix it perfectly. And that's what they do. They go out, and I always thought with that leaves no room for spontaneity at all. And also, if you're going somewhere that you haven't been before, how are you sure that the people there are going to, there were so many kind of questions to that didn't sit right with me on that level. And another thing that happened later that was a real eye-opener on a super club level was I went to Cream a couple of times. I mean, I know how important it was and everything for a lot of people, but from my perspective, it was a bit after the Lord Mayor's show. I've been to the Hacienda when it was Rave Central, and that was now 4 years previous. So, like, the Cream thing was a different thing for me, this super club idea, I was more into the clubs as they were evolving. There was a club in Liverpool called The Underground that I loved, which was gangsters and kind of scallies and dodgy people, and John Kelly came out, James Barton came out of that, who run Cream, so Cream, I only went a few times, and I remember one time that we went with a friend who was probably in his early 20s at the time, and I just went up to the bar area and was chatting, and I met someone there or something. We were only going to be there for a couple of hours, and he went straight onto the dance floor, and after those few hours I went and reclaimed him, and he come off the dance floor, and I said to him, "You've had a great time, haven't you? You danced for a few hours there." He said, "I thought the DJ was a bit shit." I couldn't understand that. I was like so shocked. I was, what? You thought you've just danced for 2 hours? Then I kind of got it, and what it was that he'd taken his pill.
Yeah.
He was going to dance regardless.
No matter what, yeah.
And that's what I saw was happening. And the equation then for me became, initially the music was the primary, and then ecstasy came on the scene, and it was an enhancer. It enhanced the music. But then the drug became the primary and the music became the secondary, and that is how I saw it, was that the drug experience became the first thing, and people kind of missing, because music is the drug, music is, And so, it's like something was lost in that, I think. But then again, there were other places and other scenes that were developing and stuff that was going on at the same time. So it depends where you are and at what point. And but I just thought, the kind of dance going overground had kind of lost a little bit of its heart, in that sense.
So that period, no real kind of interest. As you said, something else becoming the primary is like a negative thing. What was the catalyst in 2003 for your comeback?
Well, that resulted from basically being dragged kicking and screaming into the 21st century of the internet. I mean, I was always a little bit of a Luddite, even though I kind of have a reel-to-reel machine. I look kind of semi-technical. I wasn't a technical person at all. I had to be shown what to do, and then I knew what I could do then. And so I was a bit late kind of getting onto computers, but when I did, and I discovered the internet, and I discovered that there were all these forums that were talking about dance culture, and some of them were talking about the history of dance culture, and there were books that were being written as well. And in these books and in these articles and on these forums, there was a massive gaping hole with regards to the black scene. It was like people understood up to Northern Soul and they understood from rave, but they didn't understand. And one of the things I remember at the time was listening to a BBC broadcast about Manchester, and I remember, and it was supposed to do with why the Manchester thing happened and all that. And I remember they linked it directly to Northern Soul, as though it was a direct continuation. Missed out everything else. In reality, the Northern Soul scene was dead in the water by 81. Wigan Casino closed in 81, and it took a while before it revived to any level. And it was in London it revived, eventually. So the rave scene explodes in 88, so you've got a 7-year gap where there was hardly any real things like the Street Sound series. Nobody talked about it. It's like, how can you not talk about something as important, and the amount of sales that those records had, and how they influenced, those Street Sounds albums influenced that generation who started to make house music, like your kind of Mars and S Express and Cold Cuts, and they would have come through all this, and yet it was missing. And I kind of had a lot of archive material from back then. I had record lists I'd done on a weekly basis. I had all my blues and souls. I had all and I wasn't DJing then, and I had time on my side, and I started to document it and put it down and put it together and make, put everything into a right order. And then it was suggested to me that a website to document this period of time. And so I put it together, which was Electro Funk Route. I mean, somebody put it together for me, showed me what to do, but the content all went into that. And it was as a result of that that people started to say, would you do a gig? And it seemed then the right time to potentially kind of look at it again. And that's how it came. I always had that thing initially that my main objective was to draw attention to the black scene, what had led to it and what proceeded from it. And that was underlying everything that I was doing. And as a result of that I came back into DJing, and one gig led to another. It was very organic at first,
What was that first gig like?
Manchester. I mean, it was looking back at it, it was a place called the Attic in Manchester. I decided to do it. Danny Webb, who worked for Piccadilly Records, approached me, and I liked Danny, obviously Piccadilly, and I thought, the time's right, let's do it. And I would imagine there was only about 90, 100 people there, but they were the right people. And people like Ralph Lawson from Back to Basics came over for it, and a few other DJs who offered me nights with them subsequently. But also we had the forums at the time, like DJ History, and I remember there being threads on the forums, and they were talking about records I'd played that You know, I remember I played Goody Goody, It Looks Like Love, that no one seemed to know at the time at all, and Voice of Q and a few other things, you know, and people were discussing this, and, you know, it went beyond just the night, and it went then into the forums, and then within a few weeks I was in London doing a night that Chicken Lips put on, and then I did Low Life, which was a night in London. I went to Sheffield, Newcastle, and it was just as I was doing gigs, promoters from other places were asking me if I'd do, and then it got to a stage where that was 2004, and it was just building, and then I was asked in 2005 if I'd do a compilation of edits, because again, there's the thing, I didn't really realise that this re-editing situation had developed, and people were editing older tracks because of the computer technology, of course, and what was going on. Although, you know, like some before that, obviously, like myself, were doing it off tape, but I didn't know anything about the re-edit scene in New York. We didn't know about that. So when I started doing my own edits, which were in '84, I did them for radio, and the reason I did my original edits was nothing to do with clubs, but it was to try and get remix work. And the only way that I thought that they might understand and see what I might be able to do is if I did an edit of a track they knew and to show them. So I did Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Chaka Khan, Scritti Politti. These were all played on radio, but nothing ever came of it. And then, you know, I'm on that first night and I played that Chaka Khan edit that I'd done back then, that nobody was interested at the time, and all of a sudden people have come, what the hell's this? What's this? You know, and it's like this edit that I did like years ago, and people are interested now. People are engaging within this stuff, and so by default, by complete luck in a sense, I'd fallen into an evolving situation of the edit, and I'm like now somebody who goes back from a British perspective. I'm doing probably the first British re-edits in a sense, you know, back then, you know, so that set me up there, and then I'm asked to do an album, and all of a sudden I've got an album out, Created the Edit, which then takes me into Europe. I pick up European bookings, I go to the States for the first time and play in New York, and so it's jumped up a whole other level, and that continues to develop through. In 2009 is the next big step, which was the Essential Mix.
The Essential Mix.
And just a crazy thing, because I remember being asked, I remember where I was when my agent rung me and said they'd been in touch and asked for it. I was in San Francisco, I was at the luggage, you know, it was this baggage collection, and then I kind of thought, okay, what am I going to do with this? And it was 5 years then after I'd started again, and I thought to myself, okay, let's take the biggest records that I've been playing in these last 5 years and work it around that.
Yeah.
And so I did that, but I was also aware that Radio 1 had this jingle at the time, or this whole thing about in new music we trust, and I kept hearing that, thinking a lot of this stuff is old, it's being presented in a different way, but nevertheless I figured, I knew I'd done a really good job with it, and I knew that some people would really love it, but at the same time I thought there'd be an equal number of people that it wasn't their thing. So I thought it would be a bit Marmitey for that kind of. The other thing where I was mistaken as well is I remember, you know, the Essential Mix being big in the 90s when people used to, you know, say, oh, you know, well, this is Friday night, I'm going to kind of listen to the Essential Mix, and they tune in religiously to that. It obviously wasn't the same, you know, radio wasn't the same. Radio 1 didn't have the quite that power that in that way that it did then, where people were tuning in like that. But what I hadn't bargained for is that now it was global because of the internet. So the moment that mix went out, it was going round everywhere. So the next day, all of a sudden, I wake up to just, this thread is so positive. I mean, hardly anything that you could deem negative in there. And that was a complete shock. Hadn't seen that coming at all. And yeah, you know, it then becomes a classic, and then they make it a classic by naming it as one of the 10 that represent the whole, you know, history of the Essential Mix. And since then, I think Rolling Stone named it as one of the top 25 mixtapes ever. And you know, so yeah, you know, it was unexpected again. and as a result of that, that's something, again, I travel the world, people know it, talk to me about it, ask about it.
The time, like, I don't think anyone had ever heard anything like it, and that's like completely distilled to that 2-hour mix, like all of these different genres and influences, and all edited, like re-edits that you'd not heard before, and presented in such a great package, all mixed together. I think that was why people kind of responded to it so much.
No, and it's because a lot of effort went into it as well. Because
I did read your blog piece on it, and you were saying that you had 90 tracks, and you
I only used half
to
the
re-edit
tracks.
those.
Yeah, so I decided even before I started, well, the tracks can't be any more than about 2.5 minutes maximum. So I've got to edit all these tracks into a coherent 2.5 minutes. Can't just have the first 2.5 minutes. You've got to have the best bits of the track, and your mix out point, your mix in point. So I decided, rather than to do it as I went along, to do it as though I was putting together my pool of records to play, and then I would, there's certain things would have to be in there, other things might have made the cuts and might not have made the cuts. So that's how I did it, and it was a really intensive process, and it took me, although not as intensive as the electrospective mix that I did, which was the Electro tracks from 82 and 83 that I did, and that was the prototype, because I did the same thing, putting them down to size. But the difference within that, and why the electrospective was possibly even more difficult, was it had to be those tracks. So I had to fit those together, whereas I have more choice for the Essential Mix.
I mean, and so the Essential Mix kind of blew up, across the internet. You've got this huge thread, worldwide fan base now. You're kind of traveling the world, doing all these different DJ gigs. Obviously, you're very big on the festival circuit right now. Do you prefer playing in the club environment or a festival? What's your preference, and what do you bring to each kind of style of gig?
The festivals kind of feed the clubs in a way. I mean, what I realised early on in the festivals, because when I started doing festivals, which was probably, around about 2007, 2008, I started doing a fair few, and then it went more and more and become a mainstay. But at that same time, from a club side, I'm still very much on an underground scene. Now this disco thing has become a part of the mainstream, but then it was still, kind of marginal area. What I noticed in the festivals was people would come up to me and go, "What's this music you're playing?" And I'm like, "Well, it's a bit of disco, a bit of funk, a bit of indie dance, a bit of house, a few contemporary tracks." But it occurred to me that what they saw me as doing, rather than, in a sense, when I said before that we used to draw from a whole spectrum of music, so it was an old way in a sense. I'm not being one strand, I'm coming from all sorts of places with this. That to them was a new idea, through a lot of these people who'd just grown up with it being one way. So this idea of it being eclectic, or whatever you want to call it, really appealed to them. And then I'd notice people in clubs saying to me, "I saw you at Festival, I saw you at Big Chill," and that's how they were coming to. So I then began to understand that was almost like a kind of recruiting ground to bring people into the clubs. And the festivals just, it fit what I was doing, the music I was playing, that kind of vibe just worked really well. I did a couple of years as part of what they call the Invisible Players with it was a Rizzler promotion, and they did Big Chill Festival and one of the Scottish festivals. This amazing area. It only held about 400-500, but it was packed. It had this kind of amphitheatre vibe, and we played from this old van, and there'd always be 4 of us, and like Don Letts was in the first one, and Pete Fowler, who's the artist, and that, I look at that as being where I really made my mark within a festival centre. I felt, I have my place, my niche started to emerge within this, and that's continued. It's for many years I've been saying, when does this plateau and when does it start going? And fortunately, it's retained, and if anything, you've got now a situation where, like I said, disco. I mean, I don't like the term. I remember it was discussed on the DJ forums. We had this scene that was re-edits based, and it was drawn from all these things. And there was this famous thread on DJ History called "The Scene Without a Name" that I put up and said, "Look, should this be named from within, or should we wait for someone to name it? People don't know what it is." Some people said shouldn't be named. We need to keep it secret. Keep it to what this is our thing. Other people, others wanted to bring it out, but there wasn't a name. There was nothing there. And then disco comes back. For me, disco's an aspect of it, and it's like disco is the term originally wasn't a genre of music. What it meant was the music that was played in clubs and discotheque. It was discotheque music, disco music. So it works as a genre name from that context, as a catch-all name. But later, it became more specific, and so people have impression. If I say disco to somebody, it might mean to one person, the Philadelphia sound. It might mean to another person, John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever. It might mean, like really cheesy Indo-European, Ottawan, disco. It's got a lot of connotations put on it. So that was my objection, but in the same way, R&B, they brought that back. In the same way, Electro, they put another thing to that. People are, so like poor when they come to naming things. But now it is disco. That's how they term it, and it's a mainstay. It's like it's house, techno, disco is your bass styles as well, but that's what you get in festival. That's what people expect, and so I've kind of found my own niche within what I do, and it fits really well with festivals. And not just here, anywhere. I've played festivals in the States and Mexico, Australia, Japan, all these places, but it translates, and in a way, in one respect, it's an easy thing in a sense. I'm drawing from a history of music. I'm drawing from classics and cult classics, and there's a reason a lot of these tracks are that. And it doesn't. If somebody hasn't heard that stuff before, it's quite likely that they'll have a similar response to somebody who heard it the first time many years ago, because it's great music. The same way that classical music continues through. Just because it was written 200 years ago doesn't make it invalid. It's still, and certainly if contextual, like something like, the Blue Danube being put in 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's futuristic then.
Yeah.
So great music becomes timeless.
And what better way to open that door
for
someone hearing something and then falling down that rabbit hole of like, oh my god, this artist that you played from like the 70s or something, I've never heard these tracks before, and wow, I've just discovered Parliament Funkadelic for the first time or something like that.
And that is it. That for me, like you said, what underpinned you getting back into it was wanting to draw the attention to the black scene, and hopefully I've had some success in that direction. I would hope now if somebody was wanting to write a book about these histories, that would be a reference point for them now, that they wouldn't lose that reference. In the past, I don't think people did it deliberately, they just didn't have that information to hand, and so they did it. What did you just say then though about the because that was interesting,
just about someone on the dance floor hearing something like Parliament for the first time.
So as I say, what underpinned it for me before was drawing attention to that period. But once that had been achieved to a level, something else came into play, which is my underpinning more so now. I was in San Francisco and there was a friend of a friend, and she was like the kid of like someone from the hippie era, and she had that kind of vibe about her and everything. And we were in a club in San Francisco and chatting, and she turned around to me and she said, "You're a bridge builder." She explained, you take this music from the past and you bring it into now. You bridge this. And I thought, that's it. That is exactly what it is. That my big thing, and it's what you just said, is somebody comes up to me and says, what's that record you just played? Roy Ayers, for example. Roy Ayers, okay, and they go home and then they discover this, and then they discover other people, and so I lead them down roads and it's up to them to take the avenues off and find it their own way. But the possibility is there, you know. And I'm a big one on letting people know what I play. I'm not one who covers the records up. I want people to know. I want them to get that information and find out more about these artists and everything. So yeah, that's been a major part of it for me, is that realization. And it's a thing, it's an age thing as well. You realize now you're a senior citizen of this, and in fact, you know, you cannot expect people of a certain age to have any real understanding of the depth of history of what they're encountering. You know, a lot of people now they'd have no idea that techno comes from a black source, for example. They think it'd be European, out of Berlin or wherever, you know. So there's a huge passage of time. So if I'm able somehow to, you know, give that, because I think once people do get those connections, now they have the facility. The internet becomes a great thing because you can search and find, and all this music's there, and that's wonderful. And we didn't have that. Where, you know, it's a different trajectory to how we went about sourcing our music, you know, years ago, and it's great. I mean, it has its negative side because it, you know, the worth of music in a sense is like, you know, everyone's putting records out and there's so much of it, you know, so a lot of good stuff gets lost amidst that, or undervalued amidst that, and everyone's got a record label and everyone do it, but you know, everyone's got the computer software to make a basic track in the room.
Crate digging online is not as exciting as crate digging in a record shop.
Oh no, it's hard because you know, even when I, you know, go through on a regular basis to find new tracks, things that have been sent to me or what's on June or Phonic or whatever, the amount of trudging through, and it's not that it's bad. I see it as like a mediocrity in a sense, that there's a lot of, you'd say, yeah, it's a decent track, but you wouldn't want to, it's not making you kind of do cartwheels or anything, and there's a lot of stuff like that, you know. And I think a lot of it is because, you know, certainly within our side of things, you know, I used to notice years ago, I still think now that there's a potential for singers, if they wanted material in this vein, that there's so many things released that were just really backing tracks, instrumental tracks that people put together, they didn't have any vocal on, that need a vocal to make them from being a decent track to a really good track. And you know, there's so much source stuff from like 10 years ago, people putting out stuff that and I found that myself, because I want to play contemporary things as well. I want to, you know, I don't want to just be, and the way that I do it, the re-edits works for me. I didn't want to, when I came back into this, I was sure of one thing, and that was that I didn't want to be Mr. Nostalgia playing the golden hits. That was not what I was about. And so the edits allowed me to play older stuff in a contemporary fashion, and also plug in other things into that to keep that kind of freshness to it. Because I thought, if I'm going to come back into DJing and I want any longevity out of this, I've got to appeal to a younger crowd. People of my age and 10 years younger, they can only go out like once every few months because they've got kids and babysitters to get, and you know, it's too much for them, you know, so you can't rely on them for a career. And so I was aware of this balance between the past and the present, you know, and it's like the Revox being an antiquated piece of equipment. I used to work with a laptop, I use CDJs now, so it's the balance always, you know, everything that I kind of do, you know, even like when I did Discotheque Archives series for DJ Magazine, which I focused on a classic DJ record label, record and club pre-rave. I like the fact it was kind of more Zeppelin, that we got Pete Fowler to do images of all the DJs in a more cartoon, you know, to keep it, to make it, you know, not this big all our yesterdays thing. This is still relevant to now. As people who get into it is, you know, they get passionate about someone like a Larry Levan, and they want to know everything they played and all this, and you know, it resonates on because it was such a special expression in a sense, you know, and what that whole club scene, what it represented, what it evolved to, and what's been born out of it, which is where we're all at now in a sense.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to keep you from your gig anymore, so I've just got one more question, really. You've seen like the birth of the electro culture almost from like back in the early 80s, and you've obviously pushing forward this amazing kind of eclectic sound, just all encompassing this whole kind of dance music culture, us as house culture. What's your kind of outlook in terms of just this as a culture and a movement?
Well, it's people need to release And that's really important to get away from the day-to-day and, the problems and struggles of the life and everything, the work, all these things. And that's at its most basic form. It's always been that. And the DJ is a facilitator of that. Say tonight I'm playing, there'll be people in there, had a hard week's work. They want to kind of let go, get out of their head. So, you're responsible in a sense, just to be able to bring the right kind of vibe that they require. If you take that to another level, like what was happening somewhere like Legend with the Black Crowd, is it becomes part of life's necessity. That these kids in the day to day were faced with poor education, living in rundown areas, having racial abuse, having the police on the case, getting criminal records for misdemeanors. These were the day-to-day pressures, and it was a pressure cooker for those people. They rioted around that time, no wonder. And to dance, to go into a club and let that go, it was a deep thing. And again, something I often say, I hear myself repeating this, but it's the only way of explaining it in a sense, is that sometimes people will say to me, they use the term parties now. So what were the parties like back then? And I kind of go, well, Legend wasn't a party. It was more intense than that. It was it was a necessary thing. It was part of the being, that people needed this in their life. And somebody who in the day-to-day world has got nothing going for them, seemingly. They've got no job prospects, they're on the dole, they're struggling through. Because of the way they can dance, they have respect on the streets and people nod their heads to them, and that's such and such and that's so and so. And that was a special thing to witness and to be a part of. And so that's how it works with its optimum on that. But through different gradations through that, it really is about that. It's the same thing. It's people wanting to just let go and lose themselves in the music, lose themselves from the day-to-day. And it's always been the same. It's nothing to do with now. It was the same for our grandparents when they went to big dance halls and dancing in couples and stuff like that. It was the same for the kids who went to the Savoy in Harlem in the 30s and did all those wicked moves that, if you ever look back at that footage, you just go, wow, what were they doing back then, And so we're just part of a much wider tradition than we actually realise. A lot of people think it's a more recent thing, this culture, but it's been there a long time. And again, with the British side of the culture, the British are obsessive train spotter mentality. We were looking at black American music back in the 50s. Kids were buying blues and rhythm and blues stuff, and DJs in the early 60s were bringing in imports, and opening the kind of avenues that we were able to plug into later down the line. So the history is really important to me. There's a whole thing before I ever come along, so, and people think I'm kind of ancient at the start of something, so I'll go back through the century and all that, and you can see it's always there. So it's this inner need to let go with people, and you're there to facilitate that to the best of your ability.
Amazing. That's it. That's perfect to end that on. Thank you so much. That was awesome.
Let's see how long we've chatted for.
House culture.
Yes, you made it. That was an epic one, but I think fully deserving of the title of our longest episode yet. I hope you learned as much as I did. Greg certainly knows his stuff. I think the DJ world is a richer place ever since he came back to help us connect those dots between disco, electro, house and beyond. Obviously a big thanks to Greg for sneaking us in amongst his hectic schedule, and also a big thanks to the guys down at the Old Queen's Head in Islington for letting us squat in their basement for a couple of hours ahead of Greg's gig. Also, don't panic, as I know we didn't discuss any tracks for our House Culture Perfect playlist on Spotify, but what I have done is thrown in a bunch of the tracks that Greg mentioned, like the pure funk bomb that is Ball of Confusion by The Temptations, Moving by Brass Construction. That's off the album that Greg feels hasn't quite got the recognition it might deserve, but have a listen to that track, as I'm sure you house heads will recognise those vocal samples. I've also added in D-Train's You're the One for Me, as Greg mentioned, a track that is widely regarded as one of the first ever electro tunes. I also couldn't resist adding in the sun-drenched luxury mix of Greg Wilson's own Summer Came My Way, a track that was released on the super weird Substance label he founded. And finally, a track you should all be familiar with if you've ever heard Greg Wilson play live, and that's his own re-edit of Psych Magic's Mink and Shoes. These are all on House Culture's Perfect playlist on Spotify, so please search for that and follow it so you don't miss out on the choices from any of our podcast guests. Don't forget to, if you haven't heard it already, listen to Greg's classic Essential Mix from 2009. You can hear that on his SoundCloud page, and I also highly recommend reading his accompanying blog piece that explains exactly how he put it all together. You can find that on his extremely informative Being a DJ blog over at blog.gregwilson.co.uk. Once you're done there, please support us by subscribing, loving, liking, tweeting, sharing, and not forgetting to leave us a review. It could always get you a shout out on a future episode. This time around, I must say a massive thank you to Jamie McEwen, who got in touch on Instagram to tell us how much he loves these podcasts. Thanks, Jamie. Knowing that you're enjoying them makes producing them worthwhile, and us at Team HC smile. And if you've got this far into the podcast and still don't know what house culture is all about, firstly, well done. Secondly, as I always say, we at House Culture are a collective of house music fans who have come together through their mutual love of the beat to celebrate the spirit of house music. And what better way to celebrate with us than by hitting up our Instagram feed at HouseCultureNet, or by following the hashtag #TrueHouseCulture. And finally, you can reach out to me, Matt Rouse, directly on Instagram at DJ Matt Rouse. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
House Culture.